In the dim light of Ashford's jewellers on London's Bond Street, a young mother's trembling hands placed the last memento of her deceased husband on the counter, her wedding ring. Little Emily, 5 years old with a face marked by leukemia, clung weakly to her mother's skirt. The elderly jeweler, William Ashford, took the ring, examined it through his loupe, then raised his eyes to meet the woman's desperate gaze. What happened next not only saved a child from death, but revealed a secret buried for 80 years and triggered a chain of extraordinary events. For sometimes, fate chooses the darkest moments to kindle the brightest light, and a simple gesture of compassion can rewrite the history of entire generations. London drowning under relentless November rain, when Elizabeth Harper, 32 years old with a burden of grief as vast as the world on her shoulders, crossed the threshold of the venerable Ashford's jewellers. Little Emily walked beside her with faltering steps, each movement a titanic effort against the disease that had been devouring her small body for 6 months. Elizabeth's story was one that broke hearts. Widowed 2 years ago when James died in an accident at the Canary Wharf construction site, she had sold everything to pay for her daughter's treatments, furniture by furniture, memory by memory, until she was left with the emptiness of a bare flat and a single valuable item. That white gold ring James had slipped onto her finger, promising eternity at Westminster Abbey. William Ashford, 78 years of experience behind this counter, had watched generations of Londoners pass by. He knew every nuance of human need, every gradation of despair. But when he saw this young woman enter with the sick child, something in his chest stirred differently. He observed in silence as Elizabeth placed the ring on the black velvet with the delicacy of one laying down a relic. The woman's hands trembled visibly. Emily, wrapped in an oversized coat, had collapsed onto a chair, her eyes ringed with dark circles that told of sleepless nights and chemotherapy days. William examined the ring with expert movements, noting the engraving inside, "Elizabeth and James, forever," whilst his brain automatically calculated the value, £300, perhaps 350 at most. Nothing that could truly change this woman's situation. It was then that a memory ignited in the old jeweler's mind. Charlotte, his granddaughter, dead from leukemia 40 years ago, when modern treatments were a mirage and money for attempting treatment a broad and impossible dream. The remorse of having been unable to do anything still tormented him. Without saying a word, William turned to the safe. He extracted an envelope he had kept for years, £5,000 set aside for the right moment. He placed it on the counter beside the ring, then delicately took the wedding band and slipped it back onto Elizabeth's finger, who looked at him without understanding. He briefly explained about Charlotte, how this money had been waiting for years to save a life. The only condition was that she return to tell him how everything had gone when Emily was cured. Elizabeth burst into liberating tears that seemed to dissolve months of petrified anguish. Emily, seeing her mother cry, stood up and embraced her with her thin little arms. William knelt before the child, ignoring the protests of his arthritic knees, and promised her she would get better. For the first time in weeks, Elizabeth saw her daughter smile. As mother and daughter walked away in the rain, William had no idea he had just triggered a series of events that would change many lives. Fate had begun to weave its web, and this gesture of compassion was but the first thread. That night, William Ashford found no peace. The encounter with Elizabeth had awakened more than a memory. It had ignited an intuition he couldn't define. There was something familiar about this woman, something that went beyond coincidence. He went down to the shop and opened the old escritoire that had belonged to his father George. From the secret drawer, he extracted a velvet box worn by time. Inside, an 18th-century ring with a Burmese ruby, surrounded by the purest diamonds, a jewel worth a fortune, but which the Ashford family had never sold. The history of this ring was interwoven with one of the noblest and most dangerous chapters of his father's life. In May 1941, during the London Blitz, a Jewish countess, Rebecca Goldstein, had appeared at the jeweler's desperately seeking help. George had hidden her and her 8-year-old daughter Ruth in the cellar for 10 days, risking imprisonment or worse. Before departing for Canada with false papers procured by George, the Countess had left the ring with a promise. One day, this jewel would save someone as they had been saved. George had kept the secret and the ring, passing both to William. Something continued to torment William. He took the customer ledger from 1941, written in his father's precise hand. He found the entry he sought. Little Ruth Goldstein would be old enough today to be Elizabeth's mother. Heart pounding, he went to the registry office the next day. Hours of searching the archives confirmed his intuition. Ruth Goldstein had married Thomas Harper in 1975, had a daughter named Elizabeth in 1992, and died in 2010. The woman who had entered his shop was the granddaughter of the child his father had saved. The circle of fate was closing in an incredible way. But the discoveries weren't finished. Continuing his research, William found traces of a will deposited in Switzerland by Countess Rebecca before her death in 1955, a will that spoke of properties and assets in England intended for Ruth and her descendants, never claimed. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, unaware of all this, had begun the new treatment cycle for Emily at Great Ormond Street Hospital. William's £5,000 had allowed access to an experimental protocol not covered by the NHS. The child seemed to be responding well, though it was too early to claim victory. William became a constant presence at the hospital. Each day he brought something to cheer Emily: illustrated books, colored pencils, small games. It was during one of these visits that fate decided to raise the stakes. The arrival of the new head of pediatric oncology at Great Ormond Street was announced with great anticipation. Professor Alexander Goldstein, 45 years old, came from Cambridge, where he had developed revolutionary protocols for childhood leukemia. When he entered Emily's room for the first consultation, William recognized him immediately. He had the same intense eyes as Countess Rebecca in the photograph his father had kept. The two men stared at each other whilst Elizabeth, focused on Emily, didn't notice the tension. Alexander recognized in William the features of George Ashford, the man in the photograph his grandmother had shown him whilst telling him how he had saved his great-grandmother's and aunt's lives during the war. Later, in the hospital corridor, the two men spoke. Alexander confirmed he was the great-grandson of Countess Rebecca, son of Ruth's brother, who had managed to flee to America. He had returned to England specifically to search for traces of the lost family. William revealed everything. Elizabeth was Ruth's daughter, his cousin. Fate had brought them together exactly where everything had begun 80 years before. Alexander listened with growing emotion. He had a family whose existence he hadn't known about, but there was more. Alexander brought information William didn't possess. The Countess's will spoke not only of property, but of a treasure hidden before the deportations: jewelry, artworks, documents, an immense fortune whose location was encrypted in a code only direct descendants could decipher. The two men decided to ally themselves. First, Emily had to be cured. Alexander would personally supervise her case. Then, they would reveal everything to Elizabeth. But fate was impatient. One evening, Elizabeth found in William's pocket a fallen paper, the photocopy of the 1941 register with Ruth Goldstein's name circled. When William returned, he found her in tears. He could delay no longer and told her everything: the rescue, the ring, the kinship with Alexander. Elizabeth listened, stunned, as the puzzle pieces of her life came together. Her mother Ruth had never spoken of the past, had raised her in ignorance of a heritage that went far beyond the material. But at that moment, with Emily asleep in the hospital bed, Elizabeth understood that nothing mattered except her daughter's cure. Under Alexander's care, Combining the most advanced Cambridge protocols with the holistic London approach, Emily began to show extraordinary improvements. Blood values improved steadily. Energy returned to her little body. Even her hair began to grow back. It was on a spring afternoon, Emily finally strong enough for short walks, that Alexander proposed searching for the hidden heritage. Not from greed, he explained, but because these assets could guarantee treatments for so many children who couldn't afford them. The starting point was a diary Alexander had inherited. It contained clues left by Countess Rebecca, references to places in London, symbols that only those who carry the blood of the Goldsteins would understand. Elizabeth, studying the diary, began to remember strange rituals her mother Ruth performed, places in London where she took her as a child, always telling the same stories. The search led them through the East End, to places forgotten by time. With the help of the chief rabbi, they gained access to old synagogue crypts. Following the clues and Elizabeth's fragmentary memories, they found hidden symbols that, correctly interpreted, formed a map. The map led them to a 17th-century mansion in Spitalfields. The cellar owner, an elderly antiquarian, paled at the mention of the name Goldstein. His family had been guardians of the secret for 3 generations, waiting for someone to come and claim it. Behind a walled-up wall they found the secret chamber. The contents took one's breath away. Not only jewelry and artworks of inestimable value, but the entire history of the Goldstein family documented through centuries, and a letter from Countess Rebecca to her descendants. The letter spoke more of responsibility than wealth. The Countess asked that the treasure be used to continue the tradition of tzedakah, justice and charity. She specifically mentioned the Ashfords, saying half of what was found morally belonged to them for the risk taken. William categorically refused his share, but Elizabeth was inflexible. The Countess's will had to be respected. The value of the find was astronomical. The jewelry alone was worth millions, and among the artworks were a turner and 2 constables thought lost. But for Elizabeth, the true treasure was the photos, the letters, the recovered history of her family. With the resources now available, Alexander could take Emily to Boston for revolutionary CAR-T cell therapy. The journey was an odyssey of hope. William insisted on accompanying them, already the child's adoptive grandfather. After 3 months of intensive therapy, the doctors spoke the words Elizabeth dreamed of hearing: complete remission. Emily was cured. During the return flight, whilst the child slept peacefully, Elizabeth made the decision that would give meaning to everything: create a foundation to guarantee free oncological treatments for children in need. The Rebecca and Ruth Goldstein Foundation was inaugurated in a mansion adjacent to Ashford's Jewelers on Bond Street. William donated the Countess's precious ring to be auctioned. It reached £3 million at Sotheby's, London. But the true innovation was the museum annexed to the foundation. The Museum of Memory and Hope told not only the story of the Goldsteins, but of all those saved and saviors during the Blitz. At the center, in a display case, Elizabeth's wedding ring, symbol of how despair can transform into hope. Emily, completely cured.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Became the face of the foundation. At 7 years old, she told her story to sick children with touching maturity, promising the dragon could be defeated. Alexander left Great Ormond Street to direct the Foundation's medical center, attracting the world's best specialists. William continued his jewelry shop, adding weekly workshops for the Foundation's children. He taught that creating beauty helps forget pain. Some of these children, once cured, would become his apprentices. In 5 years, the Foundation had saved 1,000 children. The London model was replicated globally, thanks to philanthropists inspired by their story. A film by Richard Curtis told the story, with proceeds going to the Foundation. But for Elizabeth, everything reduced to a simple truth. No mother should have to sell her memories to save her child. 5 years after that rainy morning, the Royal Opera House hosted the gala for the 1,000th child cured, thanks to the Goldstein Foundation. Little Oliver played violin whilst the audience held their breath, moved. The notes of Elgar filled the historic hall, transforming the victory of life over death into music. Emily, now 10 years old and radiant with health, sat in the front row with a necklace created by William, half Star of David, half Christian cross, symbol of the two souls who had saved her. Her blonde hair, thick and shining, was plaited by her mother that morning, exactly as before the illness. When she climbed on stage to speak, her confident step and natural stage presence enchanted everyone. She showed a little plastic ring from a crisp packet, explaining that her roommate Sophie at the hospital had given it to her. Sophie hadn't survived. Before dying, she had made Emily promise to help other children. This worthless ring was her most precious memory, the symbol of a promise kept. Her voice didn't tremble whilst telling the story, but everyone's eyes filled with tears. Elizabeth embraced her daughter, whilst the entire hall wept. William, now 83 but still upright and proud, wiped his eyes with a linen handkerchief. Alexander, who had become a father figure to Emily, applauded with pride from the front row. Everyone understood that the true miracle wasn't the treasure found or the foundation created, but the chain of love and solidarity that had formed. The announcement of the foundation's global expansion was met with ovations. New York, Sydney, Tokyo, Cape Town, the London model would be replicated on every continent. A consortium of international philanthropists, led by a Silicon Valley billionaire whose granddaughter had been saved by the foundation, had allocated £500 million to the project. But the evening's true surprise was yet to come. William slowly rose and made his way to the stage. The opera house fell silent as the old jeweler, the man who had triggered everything with a gesture of compassion, took the microphone with hands that trembled slightly with emotion, not age. He told a story even Elizabeth didn't know. After the war, his father George had received a letter from Canada. Countess Rebecca wrote that Ruth always spoke of the good jeweler who had saved their lives. She had included a photo of teenage Ruth, happy in her new life. George had kept that photo all his life, and William had inherited it. They projected the image on the big screen. Ruth at 16, smiling in a Canadian garden. Elizabeth saw her mother young for the first time, immediately recognizing her own features in that face, but what William said next shocked everyone. George had continued to correspond secretly with Countess Rebecca for years. In one of the last letters, the Countess had written something prophetic. One day, our families will meet again. And when it happens, from pain will be born something wonderful that will help the world. William had always thought these were empty words of hope until Elizabeth crossed his shop's threshold. The theater exploded in applause lasting several minutes. But the revelations weren't finished. Alexander took the floor to announce a scientific discovery that would revolutionize childhood leukemia treatment. The Foundation's research team, studying Emily's case and other cured children, had identified a genetic marker, allowing precise prediction of which therapy would work for each patient, avoiding months of painful and often useless attempts. The discovery, already validated by the Francis Crick Institute and Karolinska, would save thousands of lives. They had called it the Emily Protocol in honor of the child who had inspired everything. Emily listened wide-eyed, understanding for the first time that her suffering had a greater meaning. During the reception after the ceremony, as guests mingled in the theater foyer, something extraordinary happened. An elderly woman approached William with hesitant steps. She introduced herself as Margaret Levy, 92 years old. She too had been hidden by the Ashfords during the war, in the jewelry shop cellar for 3 weeks. She was 8 years old then and remembered everything. George's kindness, the risk taken, the food shared when there was little for everyone. Margaret had followed the Foundation's story in the newspapers and recognized the Ashford name. She had come to say thank you 75 years later. But she also had something to give. A small wooden box George had entrusted to her as a child, telling her to keep it for when the time comes. Inside were documents proving George had saved not 2, but 87 people during the Blitz. The discovery deeply moved William, who had never known the full extent of his father's heroism. Elizabeth immediately proposed that George Ashford be recognized as British Hero of the Holocaust. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey 6 months later saw William plant a tree in honor of his father, whilst survivors from all over Britain came to pay tribute. But the most moving moment of the evening at the Opera House came at the end. Emily returned to the stage and, with the spontaneity of children, invited all the children present, cured, in treatment, siblings of patients, to join her. In minutes, the stage filled with little figures, some still bald, others with portable IVs, others bouncing with recovered energy. Together, they sang a song Emily had written during convalescence. "We are warriors of light. We fight the black dragon. With love and medicine, together we'll succeed." The children's voices, some trembling, others strong, merged into a chorus that penetrated every heart present. There wasn't a dry eye in the theater. William gave Elizabeth a new ring he had created, white gold and rose gold intertwined with a small diamond at the center. But this time, there was a surprise. He had created similar rings for all the Foundation's children, small silver rings with a colored stone, each unique. He called them Rings of Hope, and every child entering the program received one. Elizabeth put on the ring whilst reflecting on the incredible journey of the past 5 years. From the moment of absolute despair, when she had placed the wedding band on William's counter, miracles in chain had been born. The Foundation now had 32 centers in Britain and was about to open the first abroad. 8,000 children had passed through their programs, with a cure rate of 78%, 20 points above the world average. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. They didn't speak of mothers who had found their smiles again, of fathers who had regained hope, of siblings who had got their playmates back. They didn't tell of friendships born in corridors, marriages between parents who had met in waiting rooms, the solidarity network extending like a benevolent web across the country. The Foundation had become much more than a medical center. It was a community, an extended family, where no one was alone in the battle against disease. Cured children returned as teenage volunteers, parents organized support groups, even some initially skeptical doctors now donated their free time. William, observing all this from his place of honor, often thought of that rainy morning. How had such a simple gesture, giving £5,000 instead of buying a ring, triggered a revolution of compassion? But he knew the answer. His father had taught him, good begets good, in ever-widening circles, like ripples in a pond. The evening concluded with an announcement that left everyone speechless. A Hollywood producer present had decided to produce not a film, but a documentary series following different children's stories through their healing process. The profits would go entirely to the Foundation, but above all, the stories would inspire the creation of similar foundations worldwide. As guests left the theater, under a London sky unusually starry for the light pollution, Elizabeth stopped on the steps holding Emily's hand. William and Alexander caught up with them, forming an unlikely but perfect family picture. Emily looked at her mother and said simply, "Mummy, we're rich." Elizabeth was about to correct her, explain that the Foundation's money wasn't theirs, when she understood her daughter wasn't talking about money. They were rich in love, in purpose, in an extended family that included thousands of people. They were rich in saved lives and recovered smiles. In the distance, Big Ben chimed midnight. A new day was beginning, and with it, new challenges, new children to save, new battles to fight. But that night, in that perfect moment, everything seemed possible. Elizabeth's ring caught the light of a street lamp, sparkling like a little star. It was no longer the ring she had tried to sell in desperation. It had become the symbol of how, in the darkest moments, the brightest light can be born, of how an old jeweler with a golden heart had seen beyond the metal to recognize the infinite value of a life to save. And somewhere in the London night, in a small jewelry shop on Bond Street, the light remained on. William Ashford had decided to stay open 24 hours a day, not to sell jewelry, but to be ready. Ready for the next desperate mother, the next miracle disguised as tragedy, the next opportunity to transform the lead of pain into the gold of hope. For he had learned the most important lesson of all. True treasures aren't kept in safes, but given away. And in giving, they multiply infinitely, creating riches no thief can steal and no time can corrode. George's legacy lived on. The Countess's ring had kept its promise, and somewhere Ruth and James smiled, seeing their daughters transform pain into purpose, loss into a legacy of love for humanity. If this story has touched you and shown you how a single act of kindness can change the world, give a like with all your heart. Share to remind everyone that in the darkest moments, the brightest light can be born. Subscribe now to the channel for more incredible stories that show how love and solidarity can work true miracles.